Hey folks, Greg here. I'm sure glad you're with us today. Hey, I don't have to tell you that the year 2020, pretty much this entire year, has been an especially difficult year for a number of reasons. I mean, first of all, none of us, unless we're over 100 years old, none of us have ever lived through a pandemic before with the sickness and the death and with the isolation and the fear that it brings. And of course, that's just the pandemic. Other things this year, you know what they are as well as I do. Lots of things have been thrown at us in 2020, and the year's not over yet, is it? I don't know, but I suspect that many of you would agree with me when I say that this year has been just a particularly hard year. It really has. And friends, that's exactly why we're looking at the Old Testament book of Job these days. We're looking at Job right now because both the book of Job and the man Job have a lot to say to us about suffering and about getting through difficult times. You know, we're only about halfway through the book of Job. In fact, after today, we'll be exactly halfway through in terms of the number of chapters. I'm not that great at math, but even I can figure out that 21 is half of 42. But to tell you the truth, gang, we haven't yet come across a lot of answers as to why people struggle or suffer like sometimes they do. You know, I think that we will discover some answers to the problem of human suffering as we get further into the book of Job. But so far, most of the answers that we've gotten about why people suffer and about the meaning of human suffering, coming as they have from Job's three friends, who I need to say are not always the brightest crayons in the box. Most of the answers we've gotten so far about the meaning of human suffering have been pretty simplistic, to say the least, and maybe even downright wrong. But here's the deal, friends. The deal is that whether or not we ever completely understand why we sometimes suffer as we do, the deal is that Job is still a book about human suffering. We're going to get into chapters 20 and 21 in just a little bit, a few minutes. But first, I'd like to begin by asking you all a question, just one simple question. I'd like to ask you, friends, what's the first thing that you do every morning, when you first get out of bed? Now, let me qualify that question a little bit. If you think that's an awfully personal thing for me to ask, I'm not talking here about doing what a friend of mine calls the necessary thing, or putting on your glasses or anything like that. No, what I'm talking about here has more to do with what you do before you do just about anything else when you first sit down in your easy chair with your first cup of coffee, maybe while you're still in your pajamas. I mean, do you turn on the morning news? Do you check the outside temperature? What's the first thing that you do when you start out your day? I'll tell you what I usually do. The first thing that I do, while I am still in my pajamas, and even before I've had my first cup of coffee, I must confess, is to grab my cell phone in order to check my bank account balances and my other investments. I say that I confess that because I am not necessarily very proud of starting out my day in that way. I'm really not. No, really, what I'd like to be able to say to you is that I spend the first hour or two of every day praying and meditating because I'm pretty sure that's what you expect all pastors to do first thing in the morning. But that's not what I do. Now listen, I do want you to know that Rita and I do have a devotional time together every morning. Well, most every morning. But that comes after Rita gets up, a little after I've gotten up. And after we get dressed, and after we walk the hallways of our building to get a little exercise, and after we have had breakfast, and after we have brushed our teeth. Then, before we have made the bed, just in case you're wondering, and while it is still morning, believe it or not, then, and usually only then, do we have our morning devotional time together. Now, please, friends, don't be too hard on me here. I know that I should set a better example for you as a pastor, but there's a nasty streak of honesty within me that compels me to admit and to confess before I do just about anything else on just about any day of the week, before I get dressed or eat breakfast or even pray, I go online to check my portfolio. That's pretty much the first thing that I do. Now, friends, here's the thing about that. I do know that I cannot take it with me. I know that. I know that the hearse that will sometime take me to my final resting place will not have a U-Haul trailer behind it. I know all that, but for some reason, call it earthly insecurity, if you will, or just habit, for some reason, I kind of feel like I need some kind of daily reassurance that Rita and I are going to be financially solvent before I take that ride to the cemetery. I'm not necessarily proud of this, but I kind of like to know at the beginning of every day that I have enough money in the bank to pay my bills, and maybe with a little extra left over, even though I do know that I cannot take it with me. Now, I share this little bit of self-disclosure with you, even though I'm not very proud of it, because it does lead into this morning's lesson. You see, folks, if you've had a chance to read through the chapters assigned for today, Job chapter 20 and 21, you know that it's now Zophar's turn, his second turn, to speak to Job, and that a lot of what Zophar has to say has to do with being comfortable in this life, which of course does have a lot to do with money and with the things that money buys. By the way, I should probably point out, first of all, that this second speech of Zophar's is actually his last speech. As you know, if you've been with us for this series, there is a kind of a rotation going on here in the book of Job, where Job's three friends, Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite, all take turns talking to Job. But just in case you haven't looked ahead, while Eliphaz and Bildad each speak 3 times, this second speech of Zophar's is actually his last speech, his farewell address, his swan song, if you will. Now, just exactly why that is the case is a good question. Did somebody telling the story of Job around a campfire late one night? That's what people back then did, of course. They told each other stories in the Bible that got into the Bible before they ever got written down. In a lot of cases anyway, that's what Bible scholars call oral tradition. Did somebody, when they were telling that story, actually leave out the third speech by Zophar? Did a page or two of Job, after it was written down, somehow get lost? Did an early transcriber of the book of Job, either intentionally or unintentionally, leave out Zophar's speech? Or did somebody somewhere along the line, as far as the story of Job is concerned, as the story got passed down from one generation to the next, and then to the next, and then to the next, did somebody look at Zophar's 2 speeches and figure out that, well, really 2 of those speeches was really enough, more than enough, at least from him? Maybe they were so bad, these speeches of Zophar, somebody thought that he just didn't deserve a 3rd shot. Job, the book of Job is one of the longest books in the Bible. And maybe some early editor thought that shortening it a little bit, cutting to the chase, wouldn't be all that bad. We don't know why, but for whatever reason, Zophar's speech, this second speech, is also his last speech. But what I really want to say here now, friends, is that it's kind of hard to argue with Zophar, what he first has to say about the shortness of this life. It really is. It's hard to argue with Zophar about that anyway. As seniors, we can attest to the fact can't we? That the years seem to go by faster and faster as we get older. Maybe for this past year, for obvious reasons, the months just kind of seem to drag on and on. But as I read Zophar's speech in the 20th chapter of Job, I don't know about you, friends, but as I read Zophar's speech, his words, especially when he talks about those whom he calls the godless, I don't have many problems with what he says. I really don't. I mean, I have no problem at all with what Zophar says when he says that the mirth of the wicked is brief, or that the joy of the godless lasts but a moment. You might not appreciate his earthiness, I don't know, or his bluntness, but you've got to admit, don't you, that Zophar is right when he says that a godless person will perish forever like his own dung. Well, his friends can't find him, and they say to each other, where is he? I mean, seriously, folks, how can you fault Zophar when he says that a godless person will fly away like a dream? Isn't that pretty much what we believe? That those who are godly will live on in some way, but that those who are not godly, those who are godless, have only this one life to live? Like I say, I have no argument with Zophar when he speaks to Job about the fate of those who don't believe in God. Life is all too short. We know that. No, let me tell you, friends, where I do argue, and where I think we can all take issue with Zophar. He's not wrong when he talks about what will happen to those who do not believe in God, but he is wrong. Listen, friends, he is wrong when he makes the assumption that Job doesn't already know what he, Zophar, is talking about. I mean, here's the deal. Has Job ever said anything in what we have read up to this point that would in any way suggest that he does not believe in God, that he is among the godless of whom Zophar is speaking? Has Job said anything at all in any of the chapters that we have studied up until today that would show that he does not acknowledge that there is a God and that God is his God? Folks, have you read a single sentence of what Job has said in response to any of his three friends that would in any way begin to even imply that he, Job, does not love and honor and worship God? No, fact is, ladies and gentlemen, while Zophar may be right in what he is saying to Job, he misses the point entirely. The issue is not whether the ungodly deserve or do not deserve their fate, but whether Job, as a godly man, deserves his fate. The real issue here, and the rub as far as Job is concerned, is not that he doesn't believe in and love and honor and worship God. It's that the God in whom he believes and whom he loves and honors and worships in every day of his life, in every way that he knows how, through thick and thin, that God is somehow punishing him as if he were an ungodly man. The issue, at least as far as Job is concerned, is why God is causing, or at least permitting, Job to suffer like he is. That's the issue. That's what Job can't understand. Zophar is not wrong when he tells Job about what will happen to those who don't believe in God. Where Zophar is wrong, where he is dead wrong, is where he has the audacity to suggest that Job is one of those who do not believe in God. Forgive me, friends, if I seem like a broken record week after week, but this is a point that Job, the writer of the book of Job, repeats again and again and again because he wants to make sure that we understand it, that we get it. Listen, we live in a world, you and I, where we want things to make sense, do we not? We want life to make sense. Problem is, we often put ourselves in a position of deciding for ourselves what makes sense and what doesn't make sense. You know, that's one of the things that I got out of Pastor Jason Strand's message a couple of weeks ago when he talked about God, not us, but God being in control. This is not our world, friends, but God's world, a world that he created and where he is the ruler and where he is in control, a world where we simply have the privilege of living in it, but where we are in no way in charge of it. Listen, friends, this world does not have to make sense from our perspective, from our point of view. We'd like for it to make sense to us, but it doesn't have to make sense to us. And yet we continue to insist, many of us, even those of us who believe in and who worship and who submit to God, we continue to insist that things make sense according to our own limited human wisdom. We live in a world, you and I, where we at least want to try to make sense basically out of everything. Here's the deal, friends. While we think that this world should be a place where the good will always succeed and where the bad will always fail, where the upright and the decent will always be rewarded and where the bad will always be punished, where the godly will never have to endure hardship or disappointment or even absolute disaster, and where the ungodly will be the ones who will have to endure hardships and disappointments and one disaster after another simply because they are ungodly, where life will be just and fair according to our human and earthly standards of fairness. Our experience in this life, and we as seniors should have lived long enough by now to have had plenty of experience. Friends, our experience in this life should tell us by now that that is simply not always the case. In fact, it is frequently not the case. That's the deal. Friends, I wish that I knew why bad things sometimes happen to good people. People we think are good, at least pretty good. But I don't know why. I can't figure it out. You know, I was looking through some old family photographs several months ago as we were cleaning things out, and I came across a picture of myself that kind of haunts me when I think of it. And somehow, for some reason, my mind returns to that picture quite often. I just can't get it out of my mind. It's a picture of myself when I was 27 years old. Man, I was good looking back then. I mean, I had hair back then that was really something. It wasn't just cut. It wasn't even just styled. I'm telling you, friends, it was coiffed, if you know what I mean. But that's not what haunts me about this particular picture of myself. It's the circumstance, the occasion. It was a special occasion. As the pastor in the family, I had been asked by my sister to baptize her child, my infant niece, at my parents' house. Now hang tight, everybody. I know that some of you are gasping right now about baptizing a baby, but that's what Methodists do. I don't do that anymore. But the thing is that when I look at this particular photo of me on this particular day, this particular evening, dressed in my best suit as I was, what I see is a young man who doesn't look much like me, not because he has a lot of hair, but because he is staring kind of blankly and expressionlessly into the lens of a camera. I wasn't aware of how I looked that night or how I thought anybody else thought I looked. But I can look at that picture of myself now, even in my mind, and I can understand it completely. You see, on that particular night, I was pretty much numb to just about anything going on around me. I was there to do what my sister and her husband had asked me to do, and what my family, of course, had wanted me to do. But I was numb to just about any kind of feeling that night, because Rita and I had just lost our own first baby, a baby that we had expected to be born right around that time, in fact. And so here I was, going through the motions, without tears, but also without feeling much of anything, as we celebrated the birth of my sister's child, while Rita and I had expected to be celebrating also the birth of our own child. Looking back on that night, with that picture as evidence, I can acknowledge now what I couldn't even begin to feel that night, which was that was one of the saddest moments of my life. Now listen, friends, I'm not the best person in the world. I know that. In fact, I am so far from being the best person that I feel very uncomfortable even talking about such a thing. But I did think that I was a reasonably good person, a relatively decent person. And of course, I thought the same thing about Rita. She's a far better person than I am. And yet this personal tragedy that had happened to us left both of us numb. Seriously, I wish I knew why bad things sometimes happen to good people. I really do. Or why people who are just relatively good people, people who think of themselves as pretty good people, have things like that happen to them. But I don't know why. I don't know, maybe something like that, some similar circumstance like that, some personal tragedy has happened to you, and you just don't know why. For the life of you, you just can't figure it out. In 1981, Rabbi Harold Kushner wrote a best-selling book called When Bad Things Happen to Good People. He wrote that book out of his own personal experience years earlier of having learned that his 3-year-old son had a disease that would take his life in his early teens. I remember reading Rabbi Kushner's book when it first came out. I even heard him speak in person one time. I no longer have the book, but as I remember, it's been a long time, obviously, I remember that the rabbi offers very few answers to the problem of human suffering, which may have been why he named his book When Bad Things Happen to Good People, and not Why Bad Things Happen to Good People. But the thing is that bad stuff happens to all of us, doesn't it? At least now and then. And we just can't help wondering. We can't help trying to figure out how we can get along in a world when bad things happen to good people, and even why bad things happen to good people, especially when we think of ourselves as, at least relatively good people. Getting back to Zophar, what we think we know about him, like I said before, is that he was the youngest of Job's 3 friends. And I don't know for sure, but I'm thinking that maybe, maybe he was just a little too young to have known that life is not always all that fair, at least not from our perspective. We need to move on, but I hope, friends, that you can see in at least the broadest of ways here how Zophar thinks in this 20th chapter of Job. I mean, look just about anywhere you want in this chapter, and you can see pretty clearly that Zophar is convinced that bad stuff only happens to bad people. Look at his words. Food sours in the stomachs of bad people so that it becomes like the venom of snakes. If there's any prosperity, it won't last very long. Bronze-tipped arrows will pierce bad people. Floods will carry off their homes. Nothing good happens to bad people, at least not for very long. So he figures out, he infers at least that well, if bad stuff is happening to Job, then Job must have been a bad person, even if Job didn't know how he'd been bad. Or at least he'd done something terribly wrong to be suffering like he was. Zophar wasn't shy about speaking his mind, that's for sure. But I'm thinking that he was too young, maybe too immature at that particular time in his life to know that life is just not fair sometimes. Not as fair as we want it to be, anyway. Let's check out the 21st chapter of Job, where the man Job, after waiting patiently for his turn, waiting patiently with the patience of Job, I guess, finally gets his chance to reply. Listen to my words, he says to Zophar. Let this be the consolation you give me. In other words, my wet behind the ears friend, Job says to Zophar, don't expect me to be any more conciliatory toward you than you have been toward me. Bear with me while I speak, says Job. And after I have spoken, well, then I guess if you want, you can mock on. Again, Job asks his friend Zophar, just like he has asked Bildad in what we read last week, what's it to you anyway? What business is it of yours that I have anything to say? Anything at all? Is my complaint directed to a human being? Am I talking to you, Zophar? No, I'm not. This is a matter, says Job, this is a matter between me and God. How is any of this, what's happening to me right now, how is any of this your affair? And the deal is, friends, when you look at Job's words in the 21st chapter, the deal is that Job, on the other end of life from Zophar's life, Job has lived long enough to know enough about how life sometimes works. And how it works is not always in the way we want it to work. Not always to the advantage of those who are good. No, quite the opposite, actually. What Job sees when he looks around are bad people, wicked people who live on, growing older and older while they actually increase their power and their standing in society. What Job sees when he observes life is that those same bad people, those wicked people, are often surrounded by many, many children. When Job, of course, cannot forget that he just recently lost all of his children all at once. I mean, Job has quite a list going on here about how bad people, wicked people, seem to get along just fine in today's world. Their homes are safe havens that are protected by God. Their bulls breed and their cows never miscarry. They sing and they dance, they prosper, and then finally they die. But when they die, they know that they've lived nice, long lives, even though through it all, what they have done is basically to have thumbed their noses at God, saying, leave us alone, God. We have no desire to know your ways. In fact, they ask each other, these bad people, these wicked people, who is God anyway that we should be concerned about him or serve him? What's in it for us to even pray to him? Why should we care about God? Job doesn't see what Zophar sees when he looks at life from his perspective. No, from his viewpoint, Job's viewpoint, from the top of the garbage pile where he sits, life is not the same at all. No, what Job sees is a world where good people don't always do well, and where bad people do well all too often. Job, of course, as the good and righteous man he is, will have nothing to do with the wicked person's kind of life, even if life, or even if the God of life, has not treated him all that well lately. And that's because they don't understand, the wicked don't, that any prosperity that they might be enjoying right now is not, according to Job, is not in their own hands. Not because of what they have done, not because they somehow deserve it. Fact is, as far as Job is concerned, listen carefully, friends, hear me out. As far as Job is concerned, there is simply no such thing as a completely self-made man. And that's because Job knows that we didn't create ourselves. We didn't choose our own parents or the conditions of our birth. We may be able to choose some things in life. We may choose to work hard or to make the best of our circumstances. But even then, it's God who has given us the ability and the desire and the drive to make the most of things. The truth is, friends, when you get right down to it, that every single one of us needs to say that it's God who has made us what we are. Like David said in the 139th Psalm, it was God who created my inmost being and knit me together in my mother's womb. True, God gives us the freedom, the free will, to go our own way and even to make a mess of our lives if that's what we each choose to do, but that's never his desire. No, it's his desire. It's God's will for us to make the most of what he's given to us, and for us to give him the credit and the glory and the praise all along the way. Job refuses to have anything at all to do with any kind of outlook on life, no matter what happens to him personally, that says that I can do anything that I want to do and I can ignore God. Oh, he can do that, of course. A lot of people do that. God gives us that freedom. God gives us the freedom to completely ignore him if that's what we want to do. God doesn't force us to do anything. We are human beings and not robots. But Job knows both who he is and ultimately whose he is. And he will have no part of the life of the wicked. So the deal is, folks, that unlike his young friend Zophar, Job can see very clearly that the evil or the wicked sometimes do well in this life, even though it bothers him greatly when that happens. And he can see just as clearly, by looking no further than his own life, that the good and the righteous do not always avoid suffering, even though that bothers him just as much, or even more when that happens. Job here in this 21st chapter asks the question, how often? Lord, how often is the lamp of the wicked snuffed out? He asks. How often, he wants to know, does calamity come upon them? How often, he asks a third time, are the wicked like straw before the wind, like chaff swept away by a gale? It's obviously a rhetorical question, and to tell you the truth, kind of a sarcastic question. As far as Job is concerned, not nearly often enough. No one deserves their lamps to be snuffed out more than the wicked. No one deserves calamity more than the wicked. No one deserves to be swept away from the face of the earth more than the wicked. But how often does that happen? Not often enough, as far as Job is concerned. Gang, if you read through the 21st chapter of the book of Job, you can see again and again and over that the man Job is not at all uncertain about how the evil and the wicked should get along in this world. As far as he is concerned, they shouldn't get along in this world at all. He wants the evil and the wicked to get the punishment they deserve, and for them to see with their own eyes just how destructive and how selfish and how narcissistic they are. Job knows what they deserve, but they don't always get what they deserve. And the good like Job, the faithful like Job, the righteous like Job, also for some reason don't always get what they deserve. Or at least it sure seems that way, doesn't it? So Job says to Zophar one last time, "How can you console me with your nonsense? Nothing is left of your answers but falsehood." You know, friends, I thought of something this past week as I was preparing this lesson. I thought that maybe Zophar took himself out of the rotation with his two friends and made this second speech his last speech because Job put him in his place like he did. Maybe Zophar himself decided to forego his third chance to speak. In other words, he forfeited. Maybe he decided that he really didn't do very well going toe to toe with Job. I'm not sure about that, but maybe. Let's pray, shall we? Oh, Father, so often we look for answers for why things in this world turn out like they do. We have our own ideas about what's right and what's wrong. And what's right doesn't always prevail, and what's wrong isn't always treated as if it's wrong. Not the way we see it, anyway. In fact, Father, sometimes the opposite seems to be the case, where what's right sometimes seems to go unrewarded, and what's wrong sometimes, at least, seems to go unpunished. Like Job, we simply don't understand. But we do believe in you, Lord. Oh, we do believe. And we do believe in that you, not us, but you determine what is ultimately fair and just. And that you do distinguish it from what is unfair and unjust. And so without always understanding, we do still love you and worship you. And once again, give our lives to you. Thank you, Lord. Bless your holy name. Amen. Hey, folks, if you get a chance, look at the next 3 chapters of Job, if you will, chapters 22, 23, and 24 for next week's lesson. I'll look forward to seeing you then. God bless.